topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate.
I lost my audio by putting in my headset. Let's see.
We are live. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, we are having a bit of technical issues. Camica, you are on mute.
Okay, now I'm not muted. Can I plug in my headset?
I think so. Everything should be good. Can you hear me?
Barely. Maybe I shouldn't use it.
Okay, but normally you wouldn't hear me. Sorry, everybody. Can you hear me now? But it muted you
Can you
again.
hear me?
There- I can. And we are live.
Okay. I think I'm gonna leave them off, and then I'm gonna just begin. If there's background noise, everyone, then just know this is real life, what happens. And so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I'm going to introduce you and welcome you to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Camica Edwards-Abobero, and I'm standing in for Bahia Yaksan today. You can find Bahia's website at knowwhatyouvantcoaching.wordpress.com for descriptions of her diversity education courses and coaching opportunities she offers. I'm excited to be a guest host again for the It's Your Voice podcast. So to remind you, you, the audience, of who I am in my personal life, 2 call me mom, 2 call me sister, and 1 calls me wifey. In my professional life, I have worked in the public education school system since 1999, and I have been practicing as a therapist since 2015, and have been on as a guest host and as a guest. So I'm happy to be back. Today, our show is about extreme climate and its effects. And to talk with us about that from a professional standpoint, experiential standpoint, our guest is, please welcome Dr. Kwabena Asante.
Pleasure to be here with you again.
There you are. Welcome, Kwabena. I'm going to read your bio so the audience knows who you are, okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Dr. Kwabena Asante is an engineering scientist with extensive experience conducting water and climate resilience studies, planning and building data services applications, and serious games as an educational tool. He's conducted research at federal and academic research centers. Kwabena also supports state and local agencies in multi-year planning, project development, grants, and presents at industry events. He also co-authors journal articles and serves on a federal science advisory board. On this episode, he describes, and we will discuss, the social and psychological impacts of extreme climate events such as floods and wildfires. Dr. Asante, welcome and thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Always a pleasure to be here, Camica. And just a reminder with the difficulties that we had at the beginning of the show that life is never a straight line, right? Um,
Yeah.
you have ups and downs, and uh, the climate certainly experiences its fair share of those.
Yes. So is life. We have to kind of go with the flow, and there's not a lot of choice we have when things happen. I could have been more prepared, of course, but the uncertainty that we deal with in our climate, in our planet, does reflect a lot of life and the amount of control that we do have and the amount of control that we don't have. So
Absolutely.
where would you like to start our discussion today?
Well, it's we've been talking a little bit about recent events, and I live in California. I believe you live here in California as well.
Yes.
Um, and just this year, we've experienced some really extreme wildfires in Southern California. The Palisades Fire, the Eaton Fire, caused massive damage, burned acres and acres, thousands of acres of land. There were fatalities, thousands of structures, lots of homes, residential predominantly, were lost in these fires. And it's a sobering reminder that in a changing climate that we have to deal with extremes of a kind that perhaps we would not have expected in the past. In the past, we would have thought that wildfire season ends at the end of summer, early fall is about as far as it would go. So a fire in January was thought to be a wildfire was thought to be a completely unheard of. But now we are dealing with some of the worst possible fires that we could have imagined in these times. So just very real impacts of climate change impacting our communities, impacting people,
Yes.
and getting understanding what that means in the short term, in the long term, is really critical to protecting ourselves, but also protecting our communities in general.
Mhm.
So for me, it's also very personal because I work in this arena. I've worked in this arena for the past 2 decades, focused on climate change issues, both internationally and within the U.S. in different parts of the U.S. And in that work, it becomes quickly clear that there are just a whole range of things that we have to think about when it comes to these extremes. So it just makes for perfect timing for us to be able to talk about some of these issues.
Yes. You mentioned the devastating effects. You mentioned communities being ravaged, and how you're personally involved in the work. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge all the human cost and the personal effect that they're experiencing directly. That us in Northern California, we've definitely had our fair share of fires, and so we can relate on some level. But I was thinking, if that were me
Yeah,
in the Palisades and the Eaton fire, what would I grab? What would I be thinking? What emotions would come? And so I want to just have a moment of silence just to think about all the humans that are affected, the pets, homes, significant items lost, and just a moment of silence for all the loss and the grief and the lives devastated by the fires in LA. So just a moment of silence with me, please.
absolutely.
Thank you. As a
Yeah,
mental health professional, this would be considered a traumatic event. the scale of loss would be considered traumatizing and would leave some lasting invisible scars, maybe visible scars. So I just thank you for honoring the people that are directly affected, and us. We're taking a stance of how this happened. What are the thoughts and the emotions that go through people's minds when any community, not just LA, but where LA is the most recent tragedy. What happens when a natural hazard, such as a flood or wildfire, impacts a community on a human level?
Yeah, and thank you for that, Camica. And it really is important to acknowledge the pain, the trauma that communities endure. But to kind of help us kind of walk through that path, let's think of what happens when an event is coming. So if you live in places like California, you've understood for a long time that we have a set of hazards that climate hazards, extremes, wildfires, floods, droughts that impact your area. And so in the long term, you would have been preparing. You'd maintain the shrubs around your home. You would have perhaps purchase insurance. There would be various actions. Your home would be built with certain code considerations. There'd be certain actions that you would consider to prepare yourself.
Disaster
And then
preparedness.
absolutely, and initially from the prevention standpoint. But
Yes.
then when the event is imminent, for example, we see on in the news, in the various sources of information, apps, local news stations, that there's a fire that potentially could impact your area. At that point, you get into kind of that active, hey, let me monitor the situation. Is it time for me to go? Do I pack? What do I need to pick up and pack? There's a lot of anxiety that is associated with that whole preparing for an imminent event. And
Yes, and
so
like in limbo,
for
right? Because the state or the departments involved for prevention and safety say do this X, Y, and
yeah,
Z, and
yeah,
then you get to decide you're supposed to follow X, Y, and Z, but some people
right.
are in limbo about what do I do, because it's not that simple to just follow direct orders.
Absolutely. And so there's a whole range of emotions that you've got to go through with that. If there's a fire in your neighborhood or a flood imminent in your region, you're generally operating at a very high level of stress for a long time, even before the event happens.
Yes.
And then the event happens, and say your home is damaged or may not have been damaged. You've got to deal with the reality of that loss.
Yeah.
In some of these instances, we're talking about life loss. We're talking
Yes.
about loss or damage to property. You've got to deal with that set of emotions.
Yeah.
And at the same time you're dealing with it, you've got to look around your broader neighborhood. And your house may have been spared. Your neighbor's house has been completely destroyed. Even if your house is completely spared, you're still having to deal with a neighborhood that has changed.
Yes.
There is loss there. Imagine
Mhm.
living in the Palisades and having all the homes around you devastated, and yours being the only standing house. You still
Yes.
don't have a neighborhood to live in
Right.
because it's everything is gone.
So
So
you're talking
even
about the external reality, and I was referring to the internal reality of when trauma happens, when a tragedy happens. The stress response in the brain is designed to protect us with fight, flight,
right.
freeze, fawn responses. And I'll just take this minute to encourage everyone to know how they typically what tendencies they have when they respond to stress, because not only you have to deal with the reality of what has happened on the outside, there's a whole lot of stuff going on inside the body, inside the brain, inside the mind, heart, and just how you respond, how you react to stress. So I just want to put that out there too. So there's the reality of the outside world and our inner world.
And absolutely, you're spot on. So there is stuff going on inside,
Yes.
but often we start with the initial realization of the physical loss.
Okay.
Physical loss of community is going to
Yeah.
impose a certain set of emotions on you.
Okay.
If you've lost friends, you've lost you've lost neighbors, that
Right.
itself is a source of trauma.
Yes.
And that's impacting you. It's impacting your neighbors. It's impacting the first responders.
Yes.
Who
Thank you,
who
first
have to show
responder.
up, and help to either put out the fires, help to clean out if it's in the event of a flood.
Provide medical care.
Absolutely, and it's impacting the planners who, for a long time, have been preparing for these types of events, and suddenly recognizing that some of their worst fears have been realized.
Yeah.
And in effect, even though they had knowledge that this type of event could happen,
Yes.
that they failed to prevent it.
Yes.
So the long-term trauma that you're referring to follows that initial set of trauma, that initial trauma of loss, of local loss, perhaps for yourself, of communal loss, of
Yeah.
loss of relationships, and that long-term trauma is significant. And
Yes.
think about, for example, the Palisades region. There was actually a fire there 4 years ago. A much smaller fire burned a little over 1,300 acres, compared to this one that burned close to 25,000 acres. So there was a fire within that same region. So these folks have experienced the whole range of emotions again, and
Again.
and after it's that repeated trauma has long-term impacts. That
Yes.
repeated trauma happens for me as a practitioner.
Mm-hmm.
I feel it, and I'm a planner, as a climate scientist. I'm involved a lot in helping communities plan for the long term. I'm also called upon to support emergency response activities. So I've lived in both worlds of the responder, and obviously as in my private life, I've also experienced different disasters. But it's significant how that repeated traumatization happens, even when you're not involved in a direct event. So even the Palisades fire, I was not physically involved in that incident. I was not physically harmed.
Mm-hmm.
I live in Northern California. This happened in Southern California, but I still feel go through that whole feeling the pain of all the stages of that event. Through
So
all
that
the
includes us
stages
who are
of that
watching it on TV too, right? Thus who are taking in the news and taking in the coverage and reading about it daily and keeping track of the updates and the acreage and the percentage contained. Are you saying that because it's describing secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, even though we weren't directly there, but we were indirectly affected, just like the first responders weren't directly there, but they are impacted because they're helping the ones who were directly affected? Is that along the same lines as secondary vicarious trauma?
And I'll rely on you for the correct descriptions in terms of the psychological the language of psychology, but
That's what it sounds like.
absolutely, it is a trauma that you feel after the event, even if you're not directly connected to the event, just by knowing what it felt like to go through it. Every time you see it happening, whether to somebody else, to your neighbors far away, you still go through that whole cycle again of feeling this set of pains. And in fact, within the climate and environmental communities, terms have begun to emerge. Eco-anxiety, climate trauma are some of the terms that we use to describe the sense of having to relive this trauma over and
Because
over
it keeps
again.
happening over and over again. You said eco-anxiety and climate trauma?
Right, two of the terms. I'm sure there are many others, but those are two that I'm particularly familiar with. And
Okay.
eco-anxiety happens. It has a broader connotation in the sense that it's a sense of impending doom that we're destroying the environment, the
Yes.
environment, that the ecosystem that allows us to live on Earth, that natural ecosystem that we have. That we are destroying it, and so every time that action is taken that adversely impacts the environment,
Mhm.
that anxiety is felt again, and
Yeah.
sometimes it is climate, and sometimes it is not, but it's still a repeating. Sorry, phone going off here.
What you're
But
describing is the kids that I've had in my office that can't seem to focus or that can't seem to get out of this despair and hopelessness emotional state, because they're inundated with news of disasters and the climate crisis, and it's affected their mental health to the point of, it's hard for them to function. They're experiencing impairment. And I've had some teams who are deep feelers or highly sensitive and who really care about our home, planet Earth, and who are affected on a great level. And I would just want to normalize that if you're feeling that way, that you're not alone in feeling eco anxiety and climate trauma. And I was wondering if you can harken back to a time when you went through your own experience, because I was thinking about Hurricane Andrew in the 80s in Mississippi is what I remember. One example. Do you have one? Would you like to share? Do you feel comfortable sharing one of your experiences?
Absolutely, and if you don't mind, I would actually share two, because Katrina was a significant event for me. At that point, we lived in Baton Rouge, and actually I was married in Baton Rouge just before Katrina, and
Wow.
so and left on a trip, and for kind of a week after Katrina, it felt like I had lost my spouse, because
Mm.
I could not get in contact with phone lines were down, and it took a long time before we were able to reestablish a connection. And I had family all over, essentially calling me, trying to figure out what was going on.
That's awful.
As a practitioner, obviously, watching the response, both of the federal government as well as the community response to Katrina, it was disappointing for me. It was a
Yes.
personal, essentially, a low point in my career, as recognizing that that our governments were not going to be able to protect us through those types of events, and especially recognizing on the scale of look at climate models and things like that, that these types of events would happen in the future, and perhaps at a larger scale.
Mm-hmm.
It really instilled in me the idea that you've got to do all that you can in the prevention mode.
Okay.
Once the event has happened, you really cannot prevent it, cannot prevent the damage, cannot prevent the traumatic injury that's going to occur.
I imagine prevention wasn't on your mind as a newlywed. I imagine.
Certainly not prevention of that kind.
Well, yeah,
Um,
that was a good one.
and so,
What was the
and
second story that you experienced?
absolutely, and the second example that I would give would be just a more recent one. In 2023, California had an extremely wet year, where a series of what we call atmospheric river events brought a
Yes.
lot of precipitation throughout the state. We had record snowpacks, particularly in the central and southern Sierras, and for a long time, the threat of flooding was in the air, and so I participated in the emergency response activities related to those floods.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, what was striking about that was because this event unfolded over a really long time. It was 5 or 6 months of continuously watching for the risk of extreme flooding as different storms were coming in, as snowpack was building up, as little incidents would occur all over the state. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
as in the role of a first responder, we were active and for almost continuous months during the early part of that year.
I can't imagine.
That's extremely difficult.
Yes.
Recall that the Emergency Operations Center for the state essentially opens 24 hours when there's an event like that, when there's
Yeah, 'cause there's
a
no
threat
business
of that
hours. That
nature.
makes sense.
And so what became clear is that these extreme long events can burn out first responders. I
Yes.
have some colleagues that said they would not do this job again
Yeah.
because they could not handle the stress of being on for that extended period of time. Even colleagues that some quit. Those that were not inclined to quit still felt that they had to deal with extreme exhaustion. Took a long
Mm-hmm.
time to recover from that. And then
Mm-hmm.
again, if you begin to project that out and think we're entering into a period where we're going to see more of these types of events,
Mm-hmm.
then the nature of the trauma essentially begins to multiply, and its effects. This is effects on first responders, on planners,
Yeah.
on people whose job it is to help us manage through those crises.
So you said 24 hours a day for 5 months, and recording and noting and watching and preparing. So just a nonstop hypervigilance.
Absolutely, and I'm not saying that people had to work 24 hours nonstop. I mean, the
Oh, okay.
cycle. There are folks that are rotating in and out.
Okay.
But when you're in the middle of an emergency as a first responder, even if you're not personally on the job, you're not personally on that phone, you still cannot mentally disconnect. You're still
Yeah.
monitoring what's happening. You're still trying to fully understand the situation. You're still it's difficult to near impossible to turn off.
Yeah.
And so those extremely complex emergencies, as they're sometimes termed, or long-term engagements of that nature, really put a toll on first responders, but I imagine on local communities as well, as they have to deal with these kinds of events. And what's in a sense challenging is this research that's emerging that's starting to show that when we look at an event like the floods of and the research actually started with hurricanes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a study
Oh,
that
that's
was
what
done.
I have my story to tell you about Hurricane Andrew. Can I
Absolutely.
tell my story?
Absolutely, go ahead.
It was we lived in Mississippi on the Gulf Coast, And my mom and dad were monitoring, watching the news, and we got the word that we have to evacuate. And we boarded up our windows and packed up, and we drove. I think we drove north away from the coast, and evacuated to Jackson, a city, the capital city of Mississippi. And when we got back to Pass Christian, the small coastal city where we lived, is Pass Christian, Gulfport, Biloxi, those areas. The house was almost unrecognizable, and our home wasn't this safe place anymore, and glass everywhere. And just, I think that left an image in my mind of, this is what can happen to your safe space. This is what can happen to your sanctuary, your home. And to this day, this was 40 years ago, to this day, it's hard for me to sleep during storms or during thunder and lightning. And it's hard for me to sleep when there's like heavy rain, because I'm reminded of Hurricane Andrew. And you were talking about the lasting effects, like when we're experiencing things either or over and over and over. It's not just a one and done, and you can't leave the trauma like in a little box, compartmentalized, or like what you're saying about the first responders leaving work at work. Like, it's part of you, it's part of your experience. And now, what are some of the lasting consequences of the people in the Palisades fire and the Eaton fire? What are some things that, or what have your studies kind of revealed? What are the lasting effects of experiencing a trauma, either directly or indirectly, caused by natural disasters?
So as you describe your own experience with that Hurricane Andrew. Now try to imagine that Hurricane Andrew impacted a really large area, a really large swath of the southeastern U.S. Now imagine that over the course of, I don't know, the past 50 years, all the different hurricanes that have impacted that region. So a study was performed to try to assess what some of those long-term impacts of hurricanes were. And one of the shocking results they found was that often we measure the initial damage of hurricanes. We measure the initial deaths in hurricanes, the fatalities, and then we leave it at that. When people go into the process of reconstruction, and we essentially stop tracking those fatalities. But these long-term studies have shown that over the 10-15 period following each of those major hurricanes, that the fatalities in the impacted areas went up. The number of fatalities in those areas went up. Now, this is coming from the disaster management community, so they have not fully gone into that process of trying to figure out exactly why. But all fatality, counting all causes of fatalities, went up. This is critical, because the types of stress responses that you describe could easily be driving these additional deaths, and the number of deaths in the long term far exceeded the initial deaths.
Wow.
And so the trauma is real. The impacts are lasting. The impacts can actually lead to additional deaths. And in fact, we are starting. There are a few studies that have started, and I'm talking about these studies started coming out probably in the last 3 to 4 months. And there's been a couple now that have been published on floods as well, and we are actually starting to look at that in our own work.
But not wildfires yet?
I haven't seen one on wildfires, but I would not be surprised if studies started to follow that. With wildfires, actually, the expectations would be that some of the impacts would be health impacts directly related to smoke inhalation and that. But in addition, stress and the long-term impacts of stress are very real, and so those are some of so you've got to take care of that trauma, otherwise it can lead to long-term consequences and even death. And so recognizing this has been a big aha moment for us. I also want to just point out, on the global scale, when it comes to climate change, the impacts are even more dramatic, because every child growing up now knows that the climate is changing, and that there are real consequences for that. And they've described the scale of climate trauma, particularly in young people. There was one study that found over 40% of kids were dealing with some form of trauma related to climate, related to climate issues. That's staggering.
It is. You just reminded me of there was a call for counselors in my professional organization to go and help out, provide some grief counseling, loss counseling, be a safe space for kids to process the losses from a wildfire. I don't remember which one. We've had so many in California, but I distinctly remember the young man was about 7 or 8 years old, but he was talking about his favorite video game console that he told me about his games, how he would play with his friends and his family. He would tell me all the things that he was going to miss about it. And in my adult mind, I was like, you're going to miss a toy or a game that much? And to him, it was like his whole world had fallen apart. And that really stuck with me, how vividly detailed he was about how sentimental, how significant the game was for him and his life, and the loss that impacted him.
And you referred earlier in the show to the 4 different types of responses to traumatic events, and different ones of us adopt different ones. Some people want to fight back, want to fight against all the forces that are the evil forces that are causing all of this. Some people just want to run away from the issue. Some people just don't know what to do. Some people want to appease themselves, the fawning, and so the different responses and the different paths that people choose can be significant, and folks that interpret this on a larger kind of global scale, I think they feel like, I mean, we've our responses as a global community, as the United States, at different points has been different. Initially, when climate change issues started coming up, the clear dominant response was fight. No, climate is not real. Now those debates have largely disappeared from the public domain. At least it doesn't seem to occur with any intensity. Right now,
you can't change something that you're not willing to acknowledge or accept.
Well, you can deny it, and at a certain point, it takes I would say a whole lot of willpower to start denying it once you start seeing the effects on you yourself, because you start to see whether it's the loss of your neighborhood farm. It's I mean, areas of conservative as well as liberal areas of this country have experienced extreme events that of a scale that is far beyond the kinds of things that we used to see. NOAA tracks how many of these extreme events there are. When they started tracking this, Right. So NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's the organization that tracks our
No.
weather events. The National Weather Service is a part of NOAA.
Okay.
Um, ocean, marine science, and all of that.
Got it.
When they started tracking these types of extreme events, they were looking at 4 or 5 extreme events that caused $1 million worth of damage a year.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, there were 27 such events that caused $1 billion of damage.
Are you talking about the United States or globally? Not globally, right?
Within the U.S.
Just the U.S. Okay, got it.
Just
That's
within
a
the
lot.
U.S., a combination of floods, severe storms, droughts, winter storms, hurricanes,
Mhm.
wildfires,
Okay.
that caused $1 billion worth of damage.
A billion with a B.
With a B. That
Billion.
statistic is tracked. Yeah, the number is
Wow.
tracked every year. And initially they were talking about 4, and now we're talking about on the order of in the 20s. Even if you account for kind of the change in the value of the dollar, or
Oh, yes.
the purchasing power of the
Inflation.
dollar, you're still talking about easily 23 events if you normalize them to a common year. And
Mhm.
so the number of these events has grown drastically. And so now the phase in which our kind of global response to climate issues is more described as what's a collective dissociation is the term
Mm.
that is used, in
Is that when
which
people like numb out every time a story comes in? It's like, oh, another one, and it's just like normal.
pretty much
Okay.
and it's a mechanism to try to protect ourselves. It's a
Yes.
false mechanism, but it's a mechanism that's we essentially adopt, like, oh yeah, it's a bigger issue than I can deal with, so
Yes.
now let me just do something else.
Yeah.
um
Makes sense.
and it doesn't it our pain doesn't go away. We don't find ways to it really are not resolving the issue.
Yeah.
And so I guess my overall kind of counsel to people is you've got to first recognize that you're dealing with this type of trauma.
Okay.
Acknowledge that it's a real thing,
Mhm.
and uh, kind of speak up about it.
Okay.
Speaking up is part of your acknowledgement, but it's also it also allows you to have a conversation
Mhm.
broadly with
Are you talking about
others.
advocacy or just processing it and talking about it?
Well, it starts with processing it.
Okay.
Advocacy comes further down the line, but it starts with processing it.
Okay.
When folks are not willing to have that conversation, you're basically carrying the trauma on within yourself, and essentially trying to pretend that it doesn't exist.
Got it.
Talking
Yeah.
about it, having a show
It's
with
not healthy.
Camica is a great way for us to have this conversation
Yes.
in a public way, to describe the range of, you've described some of the things that you've experienced and the impressions that they made on you. I've talked
Yeah.
about mine. I'm pretty sure there's lots of people listening
Yes.
now who are dealing with or have similar experiences. And
Is it
starting
dramatic to say once you've experienced it, you're like, you're never the same? Thinking of the ripple effects through the community and the nation and the world. Is that too dramatic a statement that once you experience something like that, you're never the same?
So again, this is why I tread carefully, because I am not by any means a trained psychologist. I can
Mhm.
tell you that for me, um, it it's changed my perspective
Mm.
on how I look at um, governments and the role of
Mhm.
governments, on how
Mhm.
I look at kind of how I prepare myself, who I should be prepared to rely on.
Mhm.
I know I cannot. Outside help is not coming.
Mm-hmm.
It may come in various forms, but it really that you've got to be prepared to deal with those types of situations when they occur,
Mm-hmm.
relying on resources that you control. You
Okay.
cannot control the externals, the external forces, but
Right.
having identifiable resources that you can control. That's key. You shouldn't try to essentially manage through those situations without it.
And you're
Um,
talking about the recovery process, right? The recovery of once you've experienced something and maybe that was like too dramatic and like as far as absolutes, you'll never be the same. Maybe that is but you will be changed and but you don't have to stay stuck. You don't have to you can recover by you said by speaking up and you said by preparing. What else can
and
people
then
do?
the advocacy part.
Okay.
Um, so these are large global problems, and what I don't want people to do is to take it upon themselves that, oh no, I have to resolve everything, or I have to resolve the issue
Mm,
all by myself. Preparedness is to ensure that that you have at least a bare minimum to get by, but at the
yeah.
same time, policy changes are required. This is not a problem that can be resolved essentially by an individual, by individual action alone.
Okay.
I can do what I can to reduce my emissions. That alone is not going to resolve the issue. It's going to
Mm-hmm.
take governments. It's going to take society taking a different stance
Okay.
about how we view economic development, about how we view our sources of energy. It's going to take how we trade with other nations, how I've heard the expression used in some places, how we colonize the earth. We
Yeah.
cannot assume that we can grab all the resources that we want, that we're able to build these massive businesses, and as a result of doing all of that, we can ignore everything that's happening around the environment. So
Mm-hmm.
advocacy in moving for change in policy, in moving for change in the environment, is important and has a critical role to play. And so essentially you reclaim power for yourself by being
Yes.
able to be at the forefront. Elections matter. Pay
Yes.
attention to candidates and what they're saying about these issues, but also form communities,
Yes.
because this is
Support.
not an issue that you're going to resolve alone.
Right.
Work with others. This types of engagement in which we talk about the issues, absolutely get involved.
Mm-hmm.
Don't sit back and expect that somehow these are going to get resolved
Okay.
by others, or that they are insurmountable. We can make change if we step up together, make our
Yes.
voices heard loudly enough that
Yes.
we become a force for change.
Yes. And that's a hopeful note to wrap up on because we started out talking about the tragedy and the trauma of things that of natural disasters that we cannot control. And the effects are devastating. But what I've taken away is how we can prepare, how we can process, how we can prevent, how we can recover, and how we can affect change at the micro level and the macro level, where the laws are being made and where the changes are. Because you're right, you can't take from the planet and expect there to be no consequences. And so
Absolutely. And if you need mental health professionals are there and can help you, guide you through that process.
yes.
Camica obviously is one, but
Mm-hmm.
here our regular host is also another.
Yes,
There are
Bahia.
folks that can help you through this process.
Dr. Asante, I want to thank you for your profession. I want to thank you for your service. I want to thank you for your research. I want to thank you for the data and the putting a face on the human effects of natural disasters. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Always a pleasure talking to you, Camica.
And I'll close by saying that be sure to tune in to It's Your Voice next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time on W4CY.com or Talk for TV. May we all have enriching conversations and diversity this week. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate